I was 8 years old when I watched my stepmother's world crumble in a lawyer's office, and it all started with 5 words that changed my life forever. Most people think the worst thing that can happen to a child is losing a parent. I thought so too, until the day I discovered something even more devastating could happen at the reading of my father's will. My name is Brinley, and this is the story of how I learned that love isn't about blood, it's about choice. But before I tell you about that life-changing moment, let me introduce you to the people who shaped this story. My father was Dashiell Remington. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to build an empire from nothing, but that's exactly what he did. Quiet, thoughtful, with hands that were always covered in construction dust, he turned a small contracting business into one of the most successful construction companies in our state. But more than that, he was the kind of father who never missed a bedtime story, who taught me to ride a bike on Saturday mornings, and who called me his sunshine every single day. Then there was Serafina. She became my stepmother when I was 6, after a whirlwind romance that swept my father off his feet. Beautiful, polished, and charming in all the ways that mattered to adults, she seemed like the perfect addition to our little family. At first, she tried to win me over with expensive gifts and promises of shopping trips. I wanted so badly to love her because I could see how happy she made my father. And finally, there was Mr. Caldwell, our family lawyer, a man with silver hair and kind eyes who had helped my father build his business from the ground up. He was the type of person who remembered birthdays and always had peppermints in his desk drawer. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months after my father lost his battle with cancer. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I understood what grief felt like. I had no idea that the real shock was waiting for me in a mahogany-paneled office, where I would learn that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the cruelest betrayals. But I also learned something else that day, something that would shape the rest of my life in ways I never could have imagined. Because sometimes, just when you think you've lost everything, you discover that you were never alone at all. The reading of my father's will was supposed to be a formality, a sad but necessary step in moving forward with our lives. Instead, it became the day I learned the true meaning of family, and the day Serafina learned that greed and manipulation are no match for genuine love. So settle in, because this story will take you through heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately, the most beautiful revelation about what it truly means to be chosen by someone who loves you unconditionally. To understand why that day in the lawyer's office changed everything, you need to know what my life was like before Serafina entered it, and how dramatically things shifted after she became part of our family. My earliest memories are of my father and me against the world. My mother died in a car accident when I was 4, leaving behind a grief-stricken husband and a little girl who barely understood why mommy wasn't coming home anymore. But Dashiell Remington was determined to be both parents to me, and honestly, he succeeded in ways that still take my breath away. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of my father humming off-key in the kitchen. He'd have already been up for hours reviewing blueprints and making calls to job sites, but he never let me see the stress of running a growing business. When I stumbled into the kitchen with messy hair and sleepy eyes, he'd scoop me up and spin me around, calling me his sunshine and asking what adventures we were going to have that day. Our house wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love. Dad would come home every evening covered in dust and dirt, his work boots heavy on the hardwood floors, but he'd always clean up and spend the rest of the night focused entirely on me. We'd do homework together at the kitchen table, him patiently helping me sound out words while he sketched building plans on the side. Weekends were ours completely. He taught me to ride a bike in our driveway, running alongside me with his hand on my back, promising he wouldn't let go until I was ready. But the thing I remember most clearly was bedtime. Every single night, without fail, my father would sit on the edge of my bed and tell me stories. Not from books, but stories he made up about a brave little girl who could accomplish anything she set her mind to. He'd stroke my hair and tell me I was his greatest achievement, more valuable than any building he'd ever constructed. Those moments made me feel like the most important person in the world. Life was simple and beautiful and secure. Dad's business was thriving, and he'd started talking about expanding to other cities. I was doing well in school, had good friends, and felt completely loved and protected. I never doubted for a second that I was exactly where I belonged. Then, Serafina walked into our lives. Dad met her at a charity gala for the Children's Hospital. She was volunteering at the silent auction, elegant and sophisticated, in a way that made every man in the room turn and stare. She had this laugh that carried across the room, and when she smiled, it was like she was sharing a secret just with you. I can still picture the way my father's face lit up when he came home that night, talking about the amazing woman he'd met who seemed genuinely interested in his work and his life. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Suddenly, there were flowers delivered to our house every few days, fancy dinners that required a babysitter, and long phone conversations that made my father smile in a way I hadn't seen since before my mother died. Part of me was thrilled to see him so happy, but another part of me felt something I was too young to name at the time. I felt like I was losing my place as the center of his world. Serafina was smart about winning me over. She brought me expensive toys and pretty dresses, took me for manicures and shopping trips that made me feel grown up and special. She complimented my father constantly, telling him what a wonderful job he was doing raising me, and how mature and well-behaved I was. She seemed to understand that the way to my father's heart was through his love for me. The wedding happened 6 months after they met. I was the flower girl, wearing a dress that cost more than my father usually spent on my entire wardrobe. Serafina looked like a princess, and my father looked happier than I'd ever seen him. I threw rose petals down the aisle and tried to ignore the small voice in my head that whispered that everything was about to change. And change it did. At first, the changes were subtle. Serafina redecorated our house, replacing my mother's warm, comfortable furniture with sleek, modern pieces that looked beautiful but didn't feel like home. She hired a housekeeper, saying Dad worked too hard to worry about domestic tasks. She started planning elaborate dinner parties and social events, transforming our quiet family dinners into formal affairs with cloth napkins and multiple courses. But the biggest change was in my father. He was still loving and attentive, but I could sense him trying to balance his devotion to me with his new role as a husband. Serafina never said anything directly, but she had a way of making subtle comments about how important it was for married couples to have time alone together, how children needed to learn independence, how too much attention could spoil a child. Our bedtime stories became less frequent, replaced by grown-up time for Dad and Serafina. Our Saturday morning adventures turned into family activities that somehow always centered around Serafina's interests. I was still loved, still cherished, but I was no longer the sun around which our little family revolved. I tried to adapt because I could see how much my father cared about making his new marriage work. I wanted him to be happy, even if it meant sharing him in ways I'd never had to before. But deep down, I started to feel like I was becoming a guest in my own home, loved, but somehow separate from the real family that Dad and Serafina were building together.
The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 18 months after Dad and Serafina's wedding. I was 7 years old, eating cereal at our granite kitchen island, while Dad reviewed contracts and Serafina scrolled through her phone. The call came from Dr. Martinez, Dad's longtime physician, and I watched my father's face transform from casual concentration to stunned silence in the span of 30 seconds. "Stage 3 pancreatic cancer," he said, after hanging up, his voice hollow and distant. "They want to start treatment immediately." Serafina's reaction surprised me. Instead of rushing to comfort him, she sat frozen, her perfectly manicured hand gripping her coffee cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. "How long?" she asked, and something about the way she said it made my stomach twist with unease. 6 months to 2 years, depending on how well I respond to treatment," Dad replied, reaching for my hand across the counter. Even in his shock, his first instinct was to reassure me. "But we're going to fight this, sunshine. We're going to fight with everything we have." The next 6 months became a blur of hospitals, treatments, and watching my strong, capable father slowly fade away. But what struck me most during this time wasn't just Dad's illness. It was how differently Serafina and I dealt with it. While I spent every possible moment with my father, reading to him during chemo sessions and curling up next to him when he was too weak to get out of bed, Serafina seemed to withdraw. She'd drive him to appointments and sit in waiting rooms, but there was a distance in her eyes that I couldn't understand. She'd make phone calls in hushed tones, often stepping out of the room when Dad or I entered. I overheard fragments of these conversations. "The medical bills are astronomical," she'd whisper to someone. "I don't know how we're going to manage if this drags on much longer." Or, "I need to understand what happens to the business if he doesn't make it through this." At 7 years old, I couldn't fully grasp what she meant, but I knew it felt wrong. When I was scared about losing my father, I wanted to be close to him, to hold his hand and tell him I loved him. Serafina seemed more concerned with logistics and finances than with the man who was slipping away from us. Dad tried to shield me from the worst of his condition, but I could see the toll the treatments were taking. He lost weight rapidly. His thick brown hair fell out in clumps, and some days he was so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open. Yet he never stopped calling me his sunshine, never stopped asking about my day, never stopped making me feel like I was the most important thing in his world. "Promise me something, sunshine," he said one afternoon as I sat beside his hospital bed, coloring in a book while he dozed. "Promise me you'll always remember how much I love you, no matter what happens." "I promise, Daddy," I whispered, not understanding why he looked so worried when he said it. Serafina's behavior became increasingly strange as Dad's condition worsened. She'd have whispered arguments with him when she thought I wasn't listening, always about money and the future and being realistic about the situation. She started making comments about how expensive my private school was, how maybe we should consider simplifying our lifestyle given the circumstances. But the most unsettling change was how she looked at me. The warm, practiced smile she'd worn during their courtship was replaced by something colder, more calculating. She'd watch me with my father, and I could see something like resentment flickering in her eyes. When I'd climb into bed with Dad during his bad days, she'd make pointed comments about how I was too old to be so clingy and how I needed to give him space to rest. During Dad's final weeks, Serafina spent increasing amounts of time on the phone with lawyers and financial advisors. She'd lock herself in Dad's home office, speaking in low, urgent tones about estate planning and asset protection. When I asked Dad what she was doing, he'd just sigh and say, "She's trying to make sure we're all taken care of, sunshine." But something about the way he said it made me think he wasn't entirely convinced either. The day before Dad died, he called me into his room and held my hands in his thin, weak ones. "I need you to know something, sunshine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what happens after I am gone, you are my daughter. You are my greatest gift, and I love you more than all the stars in the sky." I didn't understand why he felt the need to say that. Of course, I was his daughter. Of course, he loved me. But there was an urgency in his voice that scared me, like he was trying to prepare me for something terrible. 3 days later, Dad passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was 8 years old, and I thought losing him was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I had no idea that the real devastation was still to come, waiting for me in a lawyer's office, where I would learn that love, betrayal, and greed could collide in ways that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The funeral was a blur of black clothing and sympathetic faces, but through it all, I noticed Serafina watching me with those calculating eyes, as if she was waiting for something. I just didn't know what.
The law office of Caldwell and Associates felt like a cathedral of mahogany and leather, the kind of place where important decisions were made and lives were changed forever. I sat in a chair that was far too big for my 8-year-old frame, my legs dangling above the Persian rug, while Serafina perched elegantly across from me in her designer black suit. It had been exactly 1 week since Dad's funeral, and I was still wearing the black dress she'd bought me for the service because she said it was appropriate for such occasions. Mr. Caldwell shuffled through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. His silver hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, and his kind eyes occasionally glanced at me with the sort of gentle concern that made me miss my father even more. He'd known Dad since the early days of the construction business, had helped him navigate contracts and expansions, and had become something of a family friend over the years. "Thank you both for coming today," Mr. Caldwell began, his voice carrying the formal tone that lawyers use when they're about to discuss serious matters. "I know this is a difficult time, but Dashiell was very specific about his wishes, and I want to ensure everything is handled exactly as he intended." Serafina leaned forward in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers clasped together. There was something different about her demeanor that day, a barely contained energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath her composed exterior. She'd been unusually quiet during the drive to the office, checking her reflection in the mirror repeatedly and smoothing down her already perfect hair. "Of course," she said, her voice honey-sweet but with an edge I'd never heard before. "Dashiell always said you were the only lawyer he trusted completely. I'm sure everything is in perfect order." Mr. Caldwell opened the leather portfolio in front of him and began reading from the will in his measured professional voice. The legal language was mostly meaningless to me. Phrases about assets and beneficiaries and tax implications that flew over my head like birds I couldn't catch, but I could see Serafina's reaction to every word, the way her spine straightened with each mention of property and investments, the subtle smile that began to play at the corners of her mouth. As the reading continued, Serafina's confidence grew visibly. She nodded approvingly at mentions of the house, the vacation property in the mountains, the substantial life insurance policy. Her eyes gleamed when Mr. Caldwell discussed the construction company's value and the various investment accounts Dad had built up over the years. She was clearly calculating numbers in her head, and from her increasingly satisfied expression, she liked what she was hearing. "Everything seems quite straightforward," she said during a brief pause, her voice carrying a note of barely suppressed triumph. "Dashiell was always so organized about these things. I'm grateful he took such good care of our future." But then Mr. Caldwell's expression shifted slightly, and he flipped to a different page in the document. "Actually, Serafina, there are a few more specific provisions that Dashiell wanted me to address. He was quite particular about these final instructions." I watched Serafina's confident smile falter for just a moment, replaced by something sharper and more alert. "What kind of provisions?" she asked, her voice tighter now. "He left specific instructions regarding a personal letter for Brinley," Mr. Caldwell explained, looking directly at me with those gentle eyes. He was very clear that this letter was to be delivered to her personally, regardless of any other circumstances. The change in Serafina was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face, and her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "A letter," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What kind of letter? Why wasn't I told about this?" Mr. Caldwell maintained his professional composure, but I could see a flicker of something, Surprise, perhaps, or concern. Cross his features. These were Dashiell's private instructions, Seraphina. He was very specific that the letter was for Brinley's eyes only, to be given to her at the reading of the will. That's ridiculous, Seraphina snapped, her carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. She's 8 years old. What could possibly be in a letter that's appropriate for a child, but not for her legal guardian? I looked back and forth between them, confused by the sudden tension in the room. Why was Seraphina so upset about a letter from my father? It seemed like the most natural thing in the world that he would want to leave me a personal message. Mr. Caldwell stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the rising tension. I understand your concerns, Seraphina, but I'm bound by my client's explicit instructions. Dashiell was very clear about this matter. This is absurd, Seraphina said, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly toppled backward. I'm her stepmother. I'm responsible for her welfare now. I should at least know what's in this letter before she reads it. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Caldwell replied firmly, moving toward an antique safe in the corner of his office. Dashiell's instructions were unambiguous. Seraphina's composure finally shattered completely. Her face flushed red with anger and something that looked almost like panic. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. That kid isn't even his. I should have told him years ago, but I didn't want to break his heart. She has no right to anything. No right to letters, no right to inheritance, no right to any of this. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt the world tilt sideways, not fully understanding what she meant, but sensing the cruelty and hatred in her voice. Mr. Caldwell froze halfway to the safe, his expression shifting from professional concern to genuine shock. Seraphina, he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning. I think you should consider very carefully what you're saying. But it was too late. The truth was out, hanging in the air between us like poison gas. Seraphina had played her hand too early, revealed her desperation too clearly, and now there was no going back. The silence that followed Seraphina's outburst felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Mr. Caldwell stood frozen by his safe, his hand still reaching for the dial, while I sat in my oversized chair trying to process words that felt too big and too cruel for my 8-year-old mind to fully understand. Seraphina, Mr. Caldwell said again, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience and the wisdom that comes from seeing families torn apart by greed. I strongly advise you to stop talking immediately. But Seraphina was beyond listening to advice. The mask she'd worn for 2 years had finally slipped completely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. No, she said, her voice rising to nearly a shout. I've kept quiet about this for too long. That child has no claim to anything Dashiell built. She's not his blood, she's not his real daughter, and I won't stand by and watch her inherit what should rightfully be mine. Mr. Caldwell turned the dial on his safe with deliberate precision, each click echoing in the suddenly charged atmosphere of his office. Dashiell's instructions were very specific about this possibility, he said quietly, his back still turned to us. He anticipated there might be objections to this letter being delivered. What do you mean? Seraphina demanded, but there was a new note in her voice now, something that sounded almost like fear. Mr. Caldwell withdrew a sealed envelope from the safe and turned to face us both. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, with my father's distinctive handwriting across the front. For my sunshine. Seeing those familiar letters, written in the same careful script that had signed birthday cards and school permission slips, made my chest tighten with grief and longing. Dashiell told me that if anyone questioned Brinley's right to receive this letter, I should tell them that he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was writing to, Mr. Caldwell said, his eyes fixed on Seraphina with an intensity that made her take a step backward. He said some people might not understand what it means to be a real father. Seraphina's face went white. That's impossible. He couldn't have known. I never told him. Perhaps you underestimated him, Mr. Caldwell replied simply, then turned to me with infinite gentleness. Brinley, your father wanted you to have this letter. He was very clear that it was meant for you, no matter what anyone else might say or do. My hands shook as I reached for the envelope. The paper felt smooth and expensive under my small fingers, and I could smell the faint scent of my father's cologne still clinging to it somehow. With everyone watching, I carefully tore open the seal and unfolded the letter inside. To my sunshine, who taught me how to love unconditionally, I read aloud in my clear 8-year-old voice. The words came easily because Dad had always made sure I was a good reader, spending countless evenings helping me sound out difficult words and celebrating every book I finished. You showed me what it means to be a real father. Being a dad isn't about biology or DNA tests or what shows up on a birth certificate. It's about choosing to love someone every single day, about putting their happiness before your own, about being there for scraped knees and bad dreams and first days of school. You taught me all of that, sunshine. You made me a father in every way that truly matters. Serafina sank into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. No, she whispered. He couldn't have known. I continued reading, my voice growing stronger with each word. Everything I have built, everything I own, everything I've worked for, the house, the business, the investments, all of it, belongs to you, Brinley. Not because the law says it should, but because you are my greatest achievement and my most precious treasure. You are my daughter, chosen and cherished, and nothing will ever change that. But the letter wasn't finished. There was more, and it was addressed directly to Serafina. To the woman listening to this, I read, my voice carrying my father's words across the mahogany-paneled room. I've known the truth about Brinley's biological father for over a year. A private investigator is surprisingly easy to hire when you have questions that need answering. Serafina's face crumpled as if she'd been physically struck. Dashel, she breathed, but it was too late for apologies or explanations. I know you thought this secret gave you power. I continued reading. I know you believed you could use it someday to justify taking everything away from the little girl who calls me daddy and means it with her whole heart. But you misunderstood something fundamental about love, Serafina. Real love isn't about possession or control or what you can gain from someone else. It's about giving freely, choosing daily, and putting someone else's well-being above your own desires. You taught me what selfishness looks like, and Brinley taught me what genuine love feels like. I choose love. I choose her. I will always choose her. The letter ended with words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Brinley, you are my sunshine, my daughter, my heart walking around outside my body. Everything I am, everything I have, everything I've built, it's all yours because you gave me the greatest gift anyone can give. You taught me how to be a real father. Serafina stood up without a word, her face a mask of devastation and defeat. She walked to the door, paused for just a moment as if she might say something, then left the office forever. I never saw her again. In that moment, sitting in Mr. Caldwell's office with my father's final gift in my hands, I learned that love really isn't about blood or biology or legal documents. It's about choice. And my father had chosen me every single day of my life, even when he knew the truth that Serafina thought would destroy everything. I was 8 years old, and I had just inherited not just a fortune, but something far more valuable. The absolute certainty that I was loved beyond measure. The silence that followed Serafina's departure felt different from the tense quiet that had filled the room during her outburst. This silence was peaceful, almost sacred, like the moment after a storm when the air feels clean and new again. I sat holding my father's letter, reading his words over and over, while Mr. Caldwell quietly gathered the legal documents and gave me time to process what had just happened. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently, settling back into his chair across from me. His kind eyes were filled with concern, but also with something that looked like admiration. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what okay meant anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been turned upside down in the span of 20 minutes, yet somehow I felt more secure than I had in months. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice small but steady. Did my daddy really know about what she said? He leaned forward, his expression serious but reassuring. Your father was one of the most thorough men I've ever known, Brinley. He didn't make important decisions without having all the information. But more than that, he loved you more than life itself. That was never in question, not for a single day. The next few months passed in a blur of legal proceedings and life adjustments. Mr. Caldwell became my temporary guardian, while the courts processed my father's will and arranged for my long-term care. True to Dad's wishes, I inherited everything: the house, the construction company, the investments, and enough money to secure my future for life. But the real inheritance, the one that mattered most, was the knowledge that my father had loved me completely and unconditionally. The construction company was placed in a trust with professional managers until I came of age, and Mr. Caldwell made sure I understood that my father had built something lasting and meaningful that would continue to provide jobs for families throughout our community. Your dad always said the business wasn't just about making money, he told me. It was about building things that would last, creating opportunities for others and leaving the world a little better than he found it. I moved in with my Aunt Rebecca, my father's younger sister, who had always been part of my life, but became my rock during those difficult transitional months. She was nothing like Serafina. Warm where Serafina had been cold, genuine where Serafina had been calculating, and absolutely devoted to honoring my father's memory and his love for me. Your daddy called me the week before he died, Aunt Rebecca told me one evening as we sat on her front porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight. He told me he wasn't worried about leaving you because he knew you were strong enough to handle whatever came next. He said you had taught him that love creates unbreakable bonds, and that those bonds don't disappear just because someone isn't physically here anymore. As I grew older, I began to understand the true magnitude of what had happened in that lawyer's office. Serafina had gambled everything on a secret she thought would destroy my relationship with my father, not realizing that his love for me was based on something far deeper than biology. She had spent 2 years positioning herself to inherit his wealth, manipulating situations and relationships to secure her future, only to discover that genuine love cannot be manipulated or controlled. Or, the private investigator's report, which Mr. Caldwell showed me when I turned 18, revealed that my biological father was a man my mother had briefly dated before she met Dad. He had never known I existed and had moved to another state years before my mother's death. The report also showed that Dad had known this information for over a year before his death, yet had never changed his behavior toward me in any way. If anything, he had become even more deliberately affectionate, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain I never doubted his love. I learned that real family isn't determined by DNA tests or birth certificates. It's built through daily choices, consistent love, and the decision to put someone else's well-being above your own convenience. Dad chose to be my father every single day, through bedtime stories and bike riding lessons, through homework help and hospital visits, through his final letter that ensured I would never question my place in his heart. Serafina disappeared from our lives completely after that day. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had expected to inherit everything and had already made plans to sell the business and move to California. Her greed and manipulation had backfired spectacularly, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge that she had underestimated the depth of a father's love for his chosen daughter. Years later, when I adopted my own 3 children, I understood even more deeply what my father had tried to teach me. Love isn't about sharing the same blood or having the same features. It's about choosing someone and committing to that choice every single day, through good times and difficult ones, through ordinary moments and life-changing events. My children know their adoption stories, and they know they were chosen deliberately and joyfully. But more than that, they know they are loved unconditionally, just as I was loved by the man who taught me that being a parent is about choosing to love, not about biological connections. Today, I run my father's construction company, which has grown into one of the largest in the state. On my desk, I keep a framed copy of his final letter, and every major decision I make is guided by the principles he taught me about love, family, and building things that last. The lesson that changed my life at 8 years old continues to shape me every day. Real love is a choice, and the people who matter most are the ones who choose you back, completely and without reservation, no matter what secrets or challenges might arise. That's the inheritance that truly matters, and it's one that can never be taken away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that they are chosen and loved. Leave a comment below, telling me about the person in your life who chose to love you unconditionally. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me every day. And if you want to hear more stories about love, family, and the moments that change everything, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week I share true stories about the power of human connection and the incredible ways that love can triumph over even the cruelest betrayals. Remember, you are someone's sunshine, you are chosen, you are loved, and that's an inheritance that no one can ever take away from you. Thank you for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next video.